Hello everybody and welcome to Inventables. My name is Andrew Camardella. We're going to take a look at Jimmy Diresta's toolbox today, and he has this design posted up on inventables.com, and he has this cool video of him making one of these things on an X-carve. Today we're going to take his design that he had originally made. We're going to remake it in easel so everybody can see the process for that, and then we're going to make it sized for the Carvey so that it makes it a little bit easier for everybody to use. So this is a scaled down version of the toolbox that he made, and as he tells it, it's an original design that he developed a while ago using traditional tools and ended up transferring it over to the CNC. He's got some interesting feedback at the end of his video where he talks about some of the issues that he had and how he fixed them, and we're going to do the same thing with our design as well. We'll kind of go through, build it up, see how it comes out, and then talk a little bit about how everything turned out at the end. The other thing that we're going to take a look at is the Inventables store here. This is the Baltic birch plywood that we'll be using, so I just wanted to point out that you could buy the sheets recut for the Carvey on the website. Here we're making a new file for our toolbox, and we're just going to start off using the box maker. So I created this first file called Diresta tote remake working 1. We'll start inputting our width, our height, and our depth, and we're going to get these box shapes that all nest together. And from there we'll start editing these shapes and actually making the toolbox that Jimmy Diresta has. You'll see that I delete 3 of the faces that the box maker automatically generates, and the reason is that we'll be editing 2 of these faces into a toolbox and cut off the tabs and make handles and things like that. The other face, the big, large, flat face, we're only going to use one of them for the bottom. We'll discard the one for the top. So here I start off by just slicing the tabs off of the top of the box. If we no longer need those, we'll essentially be making an open face box. After I do that, I add a triangle and a square here, and I'm just making the vertical support that will then nest in with our handle, and that way our handle will remain offset from the volume of the box. You'll see here that I'm doing a lot of alignment using the shape panel for each one of the shapes and playing around with the corner that the dimensions are referencing from, and then changing the dimensions so that all the pieces match up. While I was aligning these shapes, I combined them, and when I brought them into the preview, I noticed that there was a line that was left over from a little gap between the parts that I had combined. The way that I fixed this was just going in and making the triangle that I had originally generated a little bit longer and overlapping the bottom box maker face. And when I brought it back in after it was combined, everything looked correct. I move over to the long side of the box, and here I'm just going to try to add a little bit of a flourish to it and arc the edge down a little bit. And this is where I start to get into kind of saving my work. So in order to make sure that I can go forwards and backwards in the file, I make a duplicate file and I sort of save iterations of that file while I'm working. This is mainly so that if I close out my browser and my infinite undo that easel saves goes away, I can still come back and pick up the project in any space that I'm interested in. You'll see this second file pop up occasionally, and all I'm really doing here is duplicating the parts that I'm working on into this other file, and that way I'm saving an iteration as I'm moving through the design of the file. So it gets a little confusing sometimes with how I'm duplicating and copying and making these shapes, and that's just because I'm trying to iterate and make various versions of it. So don't be afraid to use the outside edges of the workspaces as scratch pad area and make multiple versions of a design. The 3D preview only previews the main work area though, so you're going to have to move pieces into the work area in order to view them and see what the preview is before it gets cut out. When you go to carve out this file, you're going to need to delete all of the extra work that's outside of your build area so that it doesn't confuse the simulation. So here I'm building the handle, and I'm actually just using the same shapes that I've been developing for the scoop that I was talking about earlier. So all I do is I add one of these curved shapes to the front of the shape as a negative so that I can sort of arch the handle, and then I'm going to resize it slightly and make sure that I have a little bit of extra overhang so that I can engage the verticals that we're going to be playing with. And then I just take the same shape, copy it, and make that a solid, and that way I essentially get a thickness to my handle and get a nice arc without really doing too much work. That also matches the design language that we've been playing with from the long edge where we cut the scoop out. Here I'm adding a rectangular shape so that we can make a hole that will accept the small straight piece that comes off of our handle, and that way our handle can be physically attached to the toolbox that we're making using just features that we created without having to add any fasteners. So here I'm adding dog bones to the complete design. The Dogbone generator tool is pretty cool, and it allows us to easily make a little bit of a relief point so that we can nest the shapes together really nicely. So here I'm just going through making sure that the shapes themselves look correct and that we're getting dog bones in the right location. The one thing to remember is that your dog bone diameter needs to be a little bit larger than your bit so that the bit actually can slot in there and cut out the material in the corner of a piece. What the threshold parameter does is essentially determine at what angle the dog bone will get created. So for things like circles that have lots of points that go all the way around the edges of them, there's an angle between two vectors, and the threshold parameter will determine whether that angle gets a dog bone or not. In our case, we're basically using right angles and a couple of very obtuse angles, so the dog bone generator doesn't really need a very large threshold in order to determine where the dog bones go. Dog bones are useful so that the parts can slot together. So you can see here that the negative shapes, or the inside tabs that are cut into a shape, have the dog bones, and that's basically to take out that little corner so that a squared shape, like the positive shape next to the negative shape, can fit inside of that tab. Now that I'm finished generating all the artwork for my shapes, all I'm doing is going through and checking that the tabs are the correct dimension. I want to make sure that the outline is on the correct side of the path. And when we originally generated the box, the paths were on path, and that means that we're basically taking a little bit from one side of the vector and a little bit from the other side of the vector. But after checking it, I saw that I needed to put the outline on the outside of the path so that it would create tabs of the right size that would fit together correctly. I created a small rectangle to use as a gauge and went around and just made sure that everything was going to fit together before I cut it out. Finally, once I'm done my line work, I'm putting all of the individual vectors that fit into a workspace onto their own workspaces in their own files. So I end up with 4 files here that have all of the line work that I need in order to carve this box out. Here I'm going through and just making sure that all the tabs are reachable and that they're not going to get cut off because they're too close to another path. So I try to make the tabs so that they're in open areas or on outside edges, not so much in corners or on inside tab areas where they're hard to reach. That helps clean up a little bit and makes things a little bit quicker. These two parts here are a little bit tight, so I'm just going to try to get them as close together as I can. And I can actually have the paths for each of the parts overlap slightly when the paths actually get cut out. The bit's not going to be cutting through any material on the second path because it will have cut it out in the previous path. Another thing I try to look for is to keep the tabs from being too close to another path. If two paths are very close together, I try to make tabs on both paths in roughly the same area, and that way I get a little bit more structure in my sheet as the carving happens. After cutting everything out, I started test fitting the pieces together and found that there was a little bit of a gap between all of the tabs. This accounted for maybe a 16th of an inch, so it wasn't terrible. It still wasn't as good as I thought it could have been. So I went through, made a bunch of measurements, figured out that the error was pretty consistent, and determined that it was probably an issue with my feeds and speeds being too fast or my depth of cut being too deep. By adjusting all of these factors, I could get a little bit of a tighter fit, but altogether, this turned out pretty well. Once I had a final test fit, I went ahead and started sanding all the pieces. I went through and opened up the holes for the handles because they were a little bit too tight. I then went through, put glue on all the tabs, and then clamped everything together so that I got a nice tight fit on everything. Even though I was able to fit everything together, there was a little bit of gap between all of the pieces that went together. So I made a putty from sawdust and wood glue and pressed it into all of the corners. After that dried, I went over everything with a sander and cleaned it up really nicely. And the finished product looks pretty good. The end result is a sturdy little tote, very reminiscent of Jimmy Diresta's design.